The Wookiees are Star Wars' most iconic alien species, appearing frequently in the films and expanded universe alike. These towering, hairy humanoids were renowned by the people of the Star Wars galaxy for their incredible strength, hair-trigger tempers, and the staggering beauty of their homeworld, the forest planet Kashyyyk. The Wookiees also had one of the richest and most fascinating cultures in the galaxy, shaped by their unique way of life and the conditions of their awe-inspiring homeworld. In this video, we'll be taking a deep dive into Wookiee culture and society, as well as a bit of the history and ecology of Kashyyyk.
Attention, Sergeant on deck!
The Wookiees hailed from the planet Kashyyyk, a truly unique world in the Kashyyyk system of the Mid-Rim's Mytaranor sector. As we've discussed in the past, the Kashyyyk system sat at the junction of several of the Mytaranor sector's most important hyperspace routes, which made the Wookiees politically and economically powerful in the later years of Republic history. Two major trade routes, the Randan Run and the Great Kashyyyk Branch, met at Kashyyyk, as did the less well-traveled Dirk-Teal Loop and the Slaver's Haunt known as the Night Road. At the heart of the Kashyyyk system was the yellow main sequence star Kashyyyk, which was orbited by 7 planets. The lifeless hothouses, Takaru and Kalalara, the habitable terrestrial worlds Kashyyyk and Trandosha, and the gas giants Alaris, Shur, and Kurrik. Kashyyyk and Trandosha each had their own indigenous sentient species, the Wookiees and the Trandoshans respectively. Each had a long-standing grudge against the other, and their homeworlds were separated by the treacherous Grill asteroid belts. The system's innermost gas giant, Alaris, also had a habitable moon known as Alaris Prime, which the Wookiees established colonies on. The Wookiees had other colonies and other systems in the Mytaranor sector as well, most notably on Quicur and Raccoon. The other worlds of the Kashyyyk system are a video in themselves, so let's stick to talking about Kashyyyk itself for now. Kashyyyk was an average-sized terrestrial world with 3 moons, 2 barren and 1 habitable, the latter of which the Wookiees colonized and used as an agricultural world. Kashyyyk itself was a forest planet, but that label doesn't really do it justice. Most of the planet's landmasses were covered in vast forests of kilometers-tall Rothrrrawr trees, which formed a layered ecosystem unlike any other in the galaxy. Kashyyyk wasn't completely a single biome planet, with that said. Large parts of its surface were covered by shallow oceans, and it also had ice caps at its poles. 60% of the planet's surface was covered by water, although much of this area wasn't ocean or seas, but rather shallow swamps with dense forest canopies. Kashyyyk's 4 continents were forest-dominated, but in a few places, the forests were split by towering mountain ranges, the rain shadows of which created a few small deserts and plains. Even within the forest regions, there was variety. On the coasts of Kashyyyk's continents, the forests were thinner and dominated by relatively short subspecies of Rothrrrawr trees, as seen in Revenge of the Sith, while deep in the heart of Kashyyyk's forests, the trees were dense and unfathomably tall, creating the layered ecosystem Kashyyyk was most known for. Kashyyyk was a blessed world by virtually any metric, but it had a secret to it. Virtually everything about its environment was artificial. In the distant past, the planet had a much different environment, but it had been heavily terraformed after it was conquered by the Rakata, the builders of the pre-Republic Infinite Empire. Kashyyyk was a very early conquest of the Infinite Empire, and it became one of many agricultural worlds the builders used to feed their armies. But Kashyyyk initially proved unable to sustain the levels of production the builders wanted it to, and so, to boost the planet's productivity, the Rakata installed a force-powered machine on the planet's surface, a terraforming device called the Builder Forge. Through manipulation of the Force, the Builder Forge accelerated the evolution of Kashyyyk's flora and fauna to make the planet a more efficient agri-world. The Rakata weren't on Kashyyyk for long. For some reason, they packed up and left in 33,598 BBY, very early in the Infinite Empire's history. However, they must have forgotten to turn off their giant terraforming device before they left, because the Builder Forge kept running after their departure, continuing the process of terraforming Kashyyyk. A little over 200 years after the Rakata left, the Builder Forge suffered a malfunction, and it began accelerating the evolution of Kashyyyk's native creatures far beyond what the builders had originally intended. This was what caused Kashyyyk's Rothrrrawrs to grow to such massive size, and it shaped the development of the rest of Kashyyyk's ecosystem as well. But because the Builder Forge was a dark side artifact, as all Rothrrrawr machines were, it also made many of Kashyyyk's native animal species highly aggressive and dangerous, filling the lower levels of the forest, the levels closest to the Builder Forge, with brutal monsters that even the Wookiees struggled to fend off, thus creating Kashyyyk as we know it. It's not entirely clear how exactly the Wookiees were involved in all of this. It was generally accepted by the galaxy's biologists that the Wookiees had evolved on Kashyyyk, but the Wookiees themselves had legends claiming that they had not always lived there and that they had traveled or been transplanted to Kashyyyk in the distant past. It's possible that they had been brought to Kashyyyk as slaves by the Rakata, or that they had migrated on their own and subsequently lost most high technology. At the very least, the Wookiees came to Kashyyyk sometime during the Infinite Empire's reign, as the Rakata enslaved the Wookiees and made them work on their farms on the planet. When the Rakata packed up and left, the Wookiees were left free, but they had to contend with the rapid development of life on Kashyyyk, which the Builder Forge was transforming into a layered deathtrap, as Captain Paleon later put it. This new environment had a dramatic impact on the Wookiees' way of life and how their society evolved. Wookiee civilization began in Kashyyyk's deep forests, the ones where the Rothrrrawr trees were kilometers tall, and though they eventually spread to other parts of the planet, building cities along the less treacherous coastal regions, their culture was still tailored to the death trap it developed in. The Wookiees of the deep forests divided their world into 7 levels. The Wookiees lived on the 7th level in the forest's upper canopy, which was the safest level. This was an awe-inspiring tangle of massive branches thick with leaves, brightly lit by shafts of sunlight during the day, and lamps hung by the Wookiees at night. Apart from the Wookiees, this level was inhabited by a wide variety of creatures. These included plants and fungi that grew on the bark of the Rothrrrawr trees, most notably Kashyyyk vines, as well as many kinds of animals. Most of the animals in the upper levels of Kashyyyk's forests were mostly harmless, though even on the 7th level, there were still a few predators that could pose a danger to passing sentients. Among them, Kinrath spiders, Mycals, and flame beetles. These predators grew more common and more dangerous the lower one descended into Kashyyyk's forests. The first few levels below the canopy, which represented the lower branches of the trees and their massive trunks, were still fairly safe, if more dangerous than the 7th level. Before long, however, the forest got truly dangerous, and even the Wookiees rarely ventured below the 4th level into the darkest depths of the forest. The 3rd and 2nd levels of the forest, which lay among the enormous tangled roots of the Rothrrrawrs, were extremely hazardous, choked with nets of vines and spiderwebs and stalked by some of the most vicious beasts in the galaxy. The 1st level, the forest floor, was even worse. The Wookiees called the lowest level of their home the Shadowlands, for they were cloaked in permanent darkness. Due to the sheer density of the Rothrrrawr tree's branches and roots, Kashyyyk got darker the deeper one descended into the forest. The highest levels got plenty of sunlight, but deeper down, the canopy blocked out so much light that it became difficult to tell night from day, and on the forest floor, the two were indistinguishable, with only a few faint shafts of sun or moonlight ever making it down that far. But the Shadowlands weren't just permanently dark, they were also densely packed with predators of the worst descriptions. Virtually everything in the Shadowlands could kill you in strange and painful ways, including the plants, and the beasts of the Shadowlands were not only vicious, but also highly intelligent. Notable monsters of the Shadowlands included the cunning Catan, the venomous viper Kinrath, and the most terrifying spiders in the galaxy, the Wyshock, also known as web weavers. These nightmares could track their prey for over a kilometer, were intelligent enough to work in groups, and could even kill the toughest opponents in moments with their potent venom and thick webbing. It was this terrifying environment that the Wookiees found themselves in after the Infinite Empire left Kashyyyk behind. In the depths of the ever-darkening Shadowlands, the Wookiees were hunted by monsters of all description, and to escape, they had to scale the Rothrrrawrs and seek sanctuary in the upper levels. But according to Wookiee legend, before they could do so, they had to uproot another species that had already laid claim to the treetops, the Catan. The Catan were some of Kashyyyk's most fearsome predators, a species of agile reptomammals with sharp claws, horns, and teeth. C'tan were some of the fiercest of Kashyyyk's predators, and the Wookiees had great respect for them, referring to them as the Old Prince. Wookiee legend held that, in the distant past, the C'tan had once ruled Kashyyyk, living in the upper levels of the forest and descending to prey on the primitive Wookiees. This was the way of things for 1,000 generations, but over time, being hunted by the C'tan caused a shift in the Wookiees. The legends claim that, by hunting the Wookiees, the C'tan gave them courage and strength, helping them unlock the Rothrrrawr, the Wookiees' inner fire which made the Wookiees such devastating warriors. With the gift of the Rothrrrawr, the Wookiees were able to fight back against the C'tan and drive them from the treetops. The C'tan were driven off into the Shadowlands, and the Wookiees took their place in the canopy, replacing them as Kashyyyk's dominant species. As part of various ceremonies, the Wookiees would descend into the Shadowlands to hunt the C'tan as the C'tan once hunted them. This was not revenge, but a display of gratitude, and through these hunts, the Wookiees believed they were teaching the C'tan what the C'tan had once taught them. One day, the Wookiees believed, the Old Prince's time would come again, and the cycle would repeat. In the meantime, however, their migration to the canopy allowed the Wookiees to thrive. They became apex predators rather than prey, and this allowed them to develop complex civilization. The Wookiees spread far across Kashyyyk and divided into tribes, each led by a chieftain, which built simple villages of wood and vines in the treetops. While they lacked many kinds of high technology, this was for a lack of need or want rather than a lack of ability. The Wookiees preferred to live simple lives in harmony with nature, and their simple societies were perfectly suited to the conditions of the forests. The Wookiees had no interest in urbanization and industry. Instead, they strived for symbiosis with the Rothrrrawrs that made up their home. But the Wookiees' peaceful way of life would not last forever. The Wookiees lived in a galaxy full of sentient life, and many other species were not as content as they to live simply for all eternity. In the galaxy beyond, as the Galactic Republic spread, outsiders started to creep ever closer to Kashyyyk. The Terranor sector was first scouted by the Republic in 16,000 BBY, but for more than 10,000 years, Kashyyyk managed to escape notice. But that wouldn't be the case forever, especially as the Wookiees' planetary neighbors, Trandoshans, developed advanced technology and took to the stars. The Trandoshans became affiliated with the Republic in 7,000 BBY, and they brought outsiders to the Kashyyyk system, though it would still be a while before they came to Kashyyyk itself. The Wookiees, by this point, had long since forgotten the Rakata and their enslavement under them. Indeed, they had forgotten that there was life on other planets. According to Wookiee legend, the first reminder the Wookiees had that there was life beyond Kashyyyk came during the time of a legendary Wookiee known as Bacca, one of the greatest of the Wookiees' legendary heroes. Bacca was an old warrior of great renown, the chieftain of the village of Rothrrrawr, and as the legend went, he was on an expedition in the Shadowlands when he came upon the wreckage of a crashed starship. There was no sign of the vessel's crew or the beings who built the ship, but Bacca understood immediately that the ship had come from another world. Bacca also understood that if this ship had crashed on Kashyyyk, then it was only a matter of time before other outsiders followed. Cautious of invaders coming to disrupt the Wookiees' way of life, he crafted a vibro sword from the ship's wreckage as a symbol of the Wookiees' independence, Bacca's blade. When Bacca died, the sword passed on to his descendants, becoming the symbol of the chieftains of Rothrrrawr for generations to come. It was a reminder to later generations of Wookiees to be on guard against outsiders, as well as a symbol of the glory of the legendary old chieftain, whose descendants bore the name suffix Bacca in his honor. Now, before we continue with our legends, let's talk about Wookiee physiology for a bit. Wookiees were a tall humanoid species, averaging at 2.1 meters tall, with grey skin and a thick coat of water-shedding hair, which usually ranged in color from brown to black. They were renowned for their incredible physical strength and endurance, and they also had keen senses of smell. As a result of their arboreal lifestyle, Wookiees had thick calf muscles, strong backs, and dexterous hands with retractable claws, the latter of which were especially important for climbing trees. Wookiees also had sharp fangs, and while they never used their claws in combat, for reasons we'll discuss later, they did sometimes bite, and when they did, their fangs could puncture even the tough, scaly skin of a Trandoshan. Wookiees were exceptional climbers, swimmers, and fighters, renowned across the galaxy for their strength and intelligence. Wookiees reproduced sexually and gave birth to live young, which were known as pups. Wookiees had a gestation period of just under a year, and at birth, Wookiee pups were quite large, being just under a meter in length. Pups matured rapidly, usually learning to walk by the time they were a year old. Early in life, Wookiee pups would spend the daytime in their village's nursery rings, located high in the treetops for protection, where they were raised communally and taught to appreciate Kashyyyk's wildlife. At night, young Wookiees were sent home so they could bond with their families, and Wookiee younglings above a certain age spent all their time at home, where their education would be continued by their parents. Wookiees reached full adult maturity at 18 years of age, but they could go on to live for centuries afterwards. This made them a bit of an anomaly among long-lived species, which usually had very long childhoods. Instead, Wookiees matured quite quickly and remained in the prime of adulthood for centuries. Wookiees were considered to be in their prime when they reached the age of 200. They were considered middle-aged past age 300 and elderly past age 350. Wookiees who lived past the age of 400 were highly honored by their communities. Wookiees were omnivores, but since their way of life more or less precluded large-scale agriculture, they subsisted primarily on the meat of animals their warriors hunted, which they supplemented with a variety of fruits and vegetables they cultivated in their villages. They preferred to season their foods with lots of spices, to the point where some Wookiee foods couldn't be eaten by humans, as the sheer volume of spice could damage a human stomach. The Wookiees distilled rosehir tree sap as their main source of water, and they were also known to drink a wide variety of homebrewed juices and alcoholic beverages, the latter of which were notoriously strong. And due to the structure of their throats, Wookiees were physically incapable of speaking Galactic Basic and many other commonly used languages, though they could be taught to understand them. Instead, the Wookiees spoke several languages of their own, which were highly complex and often difficult for outsiders to understand, let alone speak, which was partly intentional. By far the most widely known Wookiee language was Shriwok, the Wookiee trade language, which many erroneously believed to be the only Wookiee language. Shriwok was difficult but not impossible for non-Wookiees to speak and translate, and though it sounded like little more than a collection of roars and howls to the untrained ear, it was every bit as layered and complex as basic. It also wasn't the only Wookiee language. Others included Thykaran, which was mutually intelligible with Shariwook and was favored by technicians for its more precise technical terminology, and Zakzik, a more obscure language spoken by the Wookiees of the Wataki Islands. Typically, the Wookiees were a calm and gentle people. They had a deep love of nature, cared greatly for vulnerable things, and were renowned galaxy-wide for their wisdom. They were often quiet, perceptive, and weren't usually prone to the loudmouth tendencies some humans exhibited, though they wouldn't shy away from raising their voices when the situation demanded it. But though Wookiees preferred peaceful lives, they could be riled up more easily than beings from many other species, resulting in brief but violent outbursts of anger. It was when Wookiees were deeply angered, however, that they truly became a force to be reckoned with. When faced with cruelty or deep injustice, especially over long periods of time, Wookiees would eventually go ballistic, and when a Wookiee was enraged, there was very little that could stop them. This was the gift of the Rothrrrawr, and it was what made the Wookiees some of the most powerful fighters in the galaxy, as their ancient oppressors once learned. That brings us back to the story of the Wookiees' history. For many generations after Bacca discovered that crashed starship and crafted a blade from its wreckage, Kashyyyk was left alone, though the Wookiees were ever watchful for outsiders. But this watchful peace didn't last, and its end began a generation before the Great Sith War, when, to the dismay of the Wookiees of Rothrrrawr, Bacca's blade was lost. This happened in the time of a proud and arrogant chieftain named Rothrrrawr, who descended into the Shadowlands with Bacca's sword to hunt the Great Beast. This was a fearsome monster unlike any the Wookiees had ever faced before, bipedal with a thick, slimy hide, sharp claws and tusks, and a row of spines on its back. It seemed to feed on the darkness of the Shadowlands and had first appeared a few centuries before. The Wookiees had repeatedly tried to slay the beast, baiting it into a small clearing with the corpses of Viper Kinrath so they could ambush and kill it. But even their greatest warriors failed to defeat the creature, and most did not survive the attempt. Rothrrrawr, in his arrogance, believed that with Bacca's sword he could slay this great monster, but like the others before him, he failed. When Rothrrrawr stabbed the great beast with the sword, the blade snapped off its hide. Rothrrrawr escaped, but the loss of Bacca's blade was an ill omen for the Wookiees of Rothrrrawr. They held on to the hilt, which took the sword's place as the symbol of Rothrrrawr, but the meaning of what had transpired was clear to them all. Bacca's sword would no longer protect them from invaders from beyond. Many believe that this was because they had become unworthy of its protection. A few tried to retrieve the blade, but since this required killing the great beast, none had success. It was shortly after the loss of Bacca's blade that humans began arriving on Kashyyyk. These actually weren't the first trespassers to come to the planet. Trandoshans had secretly been coming to Kashyyyk to hunt lone Wookiees in the Shadowlands for centuries, considering the hairy bipeds to be non-sentient beasts that made challenging prey. But these incursions were minor and went unnoticed by most of the Wookiee tribes. It wasn't until Czerka Corporation arrived on Kashyyyk that the Wookiees' first true contact with the outside galaxy began. At the time, Czerka Corporation was the wealthiest and most powerful corporation in the galaxy, and it had gotten that way through ruthless exploitation and every form of unethical business practice under the sun. In 4020 BBY, the Czerka became the first outsiders apart from the Trandoshans to survey Kashyyyk, and after its scouts came back with stories of Kashyyyk's extraordinary Rothrrrawr forests and the strength and so-called primitive lifestyles of its native Wookiees, the corporation formally claimed to have discovered the planet. Czerka successfully lobbied the Republic to recognize its claim of discovery, and Kashyyyk illegally became a Czerka-owned world. The Wookiees had no say in this. Indeed, Czerka went to great pains to prevent the greater galaxy from even recognizing them as sentient. They convinced the Republic to classify them as semi-sentient and sidelined Wookiee culture, even going so far as to refuse the Shariwook name for the planet. The corporation saw to it that official Republic charts listed Kashyyyk simply as G5623, and they later renamed the planet to Edian, a name chosen from a poll of Czerka stockholders. At the time of Czerka's arrival on Kashyyyk, the Wookiees still lived simple, traditional lifestyles. They had developed some advanced technology, such as bowcasters, which were developed from technology salvaged from crashed starships, but on the whole, the Wookiees were considered primitive by galactic standards. This not only made them easy for Czerka to take advantage of, but when combined with the Wookiees' incredible natural strength and endurance, it made the Wookiees ideal targets for slavers. The Wookiees' strength would make them desirable to buyers looking for manual laborers, while their technological disadvantage limited their ability to fight back, and on top of all this, Czerka had been able to get the Wookiees classified as semi-sentient, which meant their sale was even legal. This was Czerka's primary goal in laying claim to Kashyyyk. They wanted to take Wookiees as slaves and sell them on the galactic market. At first, they started small. Guided by Trandoshans who had experience with Wookiees, Czerka slavers would ambush Wookiee hunters when they were alone or in small groups, catching them by surprise and taking them prisoner. But before long, they got bolder. The corporation began enslaving whole populations from smaller, more isolated villages, and they also began paying ambitious Wookiee collaborators to lure their kinsmen right into their arms. One of the worst of these traitors was Chundar, the son of Freyr, then chieftain of Rothrrrawr. Chundar was the runt of his family, but he made up for it in cunning and hunger for power. He sold numerous Wookiees from his tribe to Czerka, often political rivals or other enemies of his that he wished to be rid of. In the early 3970s BBY, his collaboration was discovered by his younger brother Zalbar, who was so enraged by Chundar's actions that he attacked him with his claws, breaking a major Wookiee taboo. Because of this, Zalbar was branded a Madclaw and banished from Kashyyyk, and Chundar was able to turn the situation to his advantage. He spread rumors that Freyr was also going mad before driving his own father into exile and usurping the chieftainship. Once chieftain, Chundar made a deal with Czerka, allowing and even contributing to the taking of Wookiee slaves in exchange for shipments of weapons for him and his followers. Under Chundar, Czerka sunk its claws ever deeper into Kashyyyk. The corporation supplied Chundar's followers with weapons and kept them in power, and in exchange, Chundar more or less gave them free reign on the planet, even going so far as to undermine Wookiee resistance by feeding his people lies. Fortunately though, Chundar's reign didn't last forever, and he was ultimately defeated before Czerka could completely crush the spirit of his people. In 3956 BBY, Zalbar returned to Kashyyyk as a companion of the redeemed Revan, to whom he had sworn a life debt. Chundar had them brought to Rothrrrawr, where he held Zalbar hostage, promising to release him if Revan went to the Shadowlands to kill Freyr, who was still alive and attacking Czerka's patrols on the forest floor. Chundar hoped that he could dupe the Jedi into doing his dirty work for him, securing his claim to the chieftainship. Instead, Revan sought out Freya and helped him stage a coup. Freya sent Revan to slay the Great Beast and reclaim Bacca's blade, which the old Wookiee hoped to use to convince his people to return to their old traditions and reject Chundar and the Czerka. This wouldn't be easy, not even for a Jedi. Indeed, as Freya told Revan, another Jedi, Gunhan Saresh, had actually come to Kashyyyk 30 years prior to hunt the beast, which he knew as a Torrentatek. Saresh too had failed, and he had been devoured by the monster. But Revan and his allies finally brought the great beast down, and they recovered Bacca's blade from its hide. Freya then returned to Rothrrrawr, bearing Bacca's blade as a symbol that he was a worthier chieftain than Chundar, one who would protect the Wookiees from outsiders and free Kashyyyk from the Czerka. Many Wookiees rallied to Freya's banner, and they clashed with Chundar's allies. In a brief but bloody battle, Freya, assisted by Revan and Zalbar, slew Chundar and his lackeys, and once he was reinstated as chieftain, Freya called for a general uprising against Czerka. All the villagers of Kashyyyk rallied to Freya's banner, rising up and slaughtering any Czerka personnel they could find. Freya's warriors stormed a Czerka outpost near Rothrrrawr, capturing the spaceport and decapitating Czerka's local branch. Czerka was forced to evacuate all its personnel from Kashyyyk, and the Wookiees finally reclaimed control of their homeworld. Under Freya's leadership, the Wookiees returned to the old ways, and they declared that no outsiders save Revan and his allies would be allowed on Kashyyyk for many years to come. For many decades after Czerka's defeat, the Wookiees reveled in their victory, but their problems weren't over yet. Though the Czerka had fled, the Trandoshans continued their own slaving raids on Kashyyyk, kidnapping or murdering Wookiees and looting villages. But the Wookiees fought back, and when the Trandoshans escalated into attempting to colonize Kashyyyk, the Wookiees routed them utterly, forcing their planetary neighbors to flee back to the stars. As they fled, the Trandoshans left behind a starship which the Wookiees reverse-engineered and used to develop their own starship technology. At long last, the Wookiees took to the stars, finally claiming their place in the galactic community. At first, galactic integration didn't go well for the Wookiees. Their first trade agreements were with the Corellians, who forced the Wookiees into accepting exploitative, one-sided trade agreements. However, the Alderaanian diplomatic corps intervened to put a quick end to this nonsense, and they successfully lobbied for Kashyyyk to be granted a seat in the Galactic Senate. Now full members of the Galactic Republic, the Wookiees' fortunes dramatically improved. They established new, more equitable trade deals with the Corellians, began a process of cultural exchange with the Alderaanians, and started trading for advanced technology with the Duros and the Verpine. Within just a few generations, the Wookiees became highly respected all over the galaxy, renowned for their wisdom, their engineering skills, and the beautiful, handcrafted artisan goods they manufactured. By the golden age of the Republic, Kashyyyk had modernized somewhat, adopting many forms of high technology. However, rather than allowing the old ways to be replaced by more cosmopolitan lifestyles, the Wookiees integrated this new technology into their traditional way of life. Their treetop villages expanded into cities, but they were always built and managed sustainably, and by galactic standards, they were still a bit rustic, if comfortable. The Wookiees began exporting botanicals harvested from the forests and the meat of Kashyyyk's animals, but they strongly regulated harvesting and hunting to ensure that Kashyyyk's environment remained stable. They even became noted manufacturers of electronic equipment, various industrial goods, and even starships, but they still kept industrialization to an absolute minimum on Kashyyyk itself, importing pre-processed metals and keeping these industries firmly under the control of guilds of artisan craftsmen. All told, the golden age of the Republic was a golden age for Kashyyyk as well, despite occasional squabbles with the Trandoshans, who'd become the junior power in the Kashyyyk system to their indignation. The Wookiees established colonies on several moons in their home system and on planets in neighboring systems, and Kashyyyk itself became the standard for Republic development in the Mid-Rim. Wookiee senators representing the Mytaranor sector, such as Senator Yarua, became revered in the Senate for their wisdom and attunement to the Force, and some Wookiees became Jedi, including the famed master Tyvoka. Others became very prominent astronavigators, as the Wookiees had a knack for charting hyperspace routes they soon put to good use. These Wookiee navigators formed the Klatuvak Guild, a secret society of hyperspace scouts based in Kachiro who blazed thousands of secret hyperspace routes all across the galaxy. Even as the Wookiees became a valuable part of the galactic community, however, their civilization back on Kashyyyk maintained the same basic structure as it had had for tens of thousands of years. Wookiees were still organized into clans and tribes, though these were no longer tied to specific villages, as the Wookiee settlements had expanded into cities and had become more interconnected. All Wookiee settlements were still led by individual chieftains, however, or sometimes councils of chieftains who were chosen from among a Wookiee community's wisest elders. Each Wookiee community also had a holder of the laws, an elder Wookiee who studied and enforced all of the Wookiees' laws and customs, acting as a judge for their settlements. Each settlement also had a few families of tree carers, which were especially honored Wookiees who devoted their lives to tending their settlement's Rothrrrawr trees. Apart from caring for the trees, the tree carers gathered Rothrrrawr seeds to plant new trees, and they also maintained religious shrines and acted as community shamans. All of the Wookiee chieftains answered to Kashyyyk's central government, which consisted of the Wookiee Council, a legislature that handled most matters of state, as well as another council consisting of representatives of the Kashyyyk royal families, the oldest and most honored clans of the Wookiees. The Wookiee government was led by a monarch chosen from among the royal families who weighed in on important state decisions such as whether or not to go to war. At the time of the Clone Wars, the reigning monarch was King Grakchawa. In the Republic's final centuries, Kashyyyk was a thriving trade world, and Wookiee-made exports were high in demand all across the galaxy. The Wookiees were second to none when it came to blending modern technology with what some would consider primitive materials, to the point where they often used Rothrrrawr wood for starship hulls and could convert Rothrrrawr sap into aircraft fuel. They had a real knack for engineering, and high technology manufactured on Kashyyyk was renowned for its reliable quality. Wookiee companies like Urbabavov Joiners and Artisans, Kashyyyk Corp, and Apazana Engineering Works produced starships, aircraft, and even starfighters, some of which were sold on the open market, while others were used solely by the Wookiee government. Handcrafted Wookiee goods also fetched a high price on the galactic market, as Wookiees were also renowned for their wood carving abilities, which they learned at an early age and practiced regularly. The capital of Kashyyyk was the city of Rothrrrawr, which was located at the heart of one of the planet's deep forest regions, not far from the location of the ancient Builder Forge. Once a simple treetop village, Rothrrrawr had long ago expanded into a sprawling city spread across the branches of several trees. It hosted a thriving starport, the largest and most important on Kashyyyk, and was home to many of the descendants of Bacca who had ruled over Rothrrrawr back when it was a simple village. Despite Rothrrrawr being the capital of Kashyyyk, the royal families instead lived in a different settlement known as the Royal City, which was located along the planet's coasts, built within tropical dwarf Rothrrrawrs. But Rothrrrawr, at any rate, was Kashyyyk's economic hub, as well as the heart of Wookiee culture. Second only to Rothrrrawr was the city of Kashyyyk, a similarly large and populous city that you might remember from Revenge of the Sith. Kashyyyk was another coastal city located in one of Kashyyyk's tropical regions, and it was built within the hollowed-out trunks of several tropical dwarf Rothrrrawrs, including Tree Kashyyyk and Tree Avikalin. Kashyyyk housed a spaceport, numerous landing platforms for aircraft, thriving market districts, and the headquarters of the Kladuvak Guild, the latter of which made Kashyyyk the hub of Wookiee hyperspace mapping efforts. Kashyyyk was one of several Wookiee cities in the Wawat archipelago, a cluster of tropical islands home to thin forests of smaller Rothrrrawrs and towering, steep-sided mountains. Kashyyyk's neighboring settlements included Waralok, Kashyyyk, Palsang, Rarakruk, and Grunra. Most of Kashyyyk's other prominent cities were, like Rothrrrawr, located in the deep forest regions. These included the third largest city, Thikiana, which was another major spaceport that doubled as Kashyyyk's industrial hub. Thikiana was best known as a hub of computer manufacturing, and though this industry wasn't the most glamorous, computers produced here saw use in the capital ships of the New Republic Defense Fleet, among others. The deep forested cities of Maroro and Horkuk were also manufacturing centers, while the city of Orior primarily produced agricultural goods. The Wookiees' way of life was governed by a complex set of traditions and honor codes, collectively known as the Way of the Wookiee. These traditions governed everything from how Wookiees raised their offspring to how they dealt with grudges. Most significantly, the Wookiee honor code dictated what was considered honorable conduct in combat, what constitutes proper care for the Rothrrrawrs and other parts of Kashyyyk's ecosystem, and what duties Wookiees had in their family lives. This last category of honor codes was perhaps the most important, as Wookiees held family in high regard. Wookiees were monogamous and mated for life. Couples would usually have 2 to 3 pups, though this wasn't a hard and fast rule. Wookiee couples and their pups typically lived with large extended families, the females of which typically did the bulk of the work in raising and caring for their pups, as Wookiee males were often away for long stretches of time hunting. Even in the modern era, when Wookiees were less dependent on subsistence hunting, it was entirely normal for male Wookiees to leave their families for years at a time, whether to hunt or travel the stars. In this and other respects, Wookiee society was broadly patriarchal. Though Wookiee females still had full rights and could attain positions of power, most of the power in Wookiee society was usually held by males. Apart from their biological families, however, Wookiees also maintained honor families, a collection of close friends and allies who they treated as relatives and were often indebted to. Wookiees were committed to laying down their lives to members of their honor families if need be. Wookiees and non-Wookiees alike could become members of an honor family. Chewbacca, for instance, considered the other heroes of Yavin to be his honor family, while Yoda was part of the honor families of several powerful Wookiee chieftains. Related to the tradition of the honor family was the Wookiee life debt. Wookiee legend held that this tradition started when the Wookiee elder Stalpak saved the warrior Uruthko from the fire spirit Grashad, following which Uruthko pledged to serve Stalpak for the rest of his life. Following this example, when a Wookiee's life was saved by another, whether literally or by, for example, saving them from a life of slavery, they would swear their service to that being, devoting their lives to protecting them and doing as they asked. Wookiees took their life debts extremely seriously and often extended them to the family of the person who saved them. Those who were owed Wookiee life debts became part of the Wookiees' honor family, and they were honored not just by the Wookiee who owed them a debt, but by all their kin. The life debt was considered one of the Wookiees' most important traditions, a way of showing respect and reverence for life, and gratitude to the kindness of others, and disrespecting or disregarding a life debt was one of the most dishonorable things a Wookiee could ever do. Other notable Wookiee traditions included celebration of the holiday of Life Day, which celebrated the ecology of Kashyyyk and doubled as a day of remembrance, and several different traditions that involved ceremonial hunts. The greatest Wookiee hunters would regularly descend into the Shadowlands to prove their strength against the beasts that dwelled there, especially the Catan, while lesser hunters stuck to hunting in the middle levels of the forest. However, all Wookiee males were required to hunt in the Shadowlands at least once during their Hirtak ceremony. Also known as the Test of Ascension, this was a coming-of-age ceremony that saw young Wookiee males, usually 12 years old or so, descend into the Shadowlands and learn to survive there. In the Shadowlands, the youth would learn various survival skills, from how to avoid predators to how to make ropes from Kashyyyk vines, and they would also engage in ritual hunts of Catan and other creatures. The point of these trials was to unlock the Raktor in the young Wook, at which point they would become an adult. Usually, young Wookiees were accompanied on their Tests of Ascension ceremonies by their fathers and/or a few friends who would teach the younglings survival skills and help keep them alive. Teamwork was practically required for the last part of the ceremony, in which the young Wookiee had to harvest the inner fibers of a sarin plant. This was a carnivorous plant that grew around the Well of the Dead, a location in the Shadowlands. Sarin plants resembled large flowers with fleshy yellow petals with a tuft of white fibers between. The fibers emitted pheromones that lured prey close, following which the petals would snap shut and the prey would be digested. Young Wookiees had to harvest the fibers from a sarin plant without getting eaten by it, which they usually accomplished by having friends hold the petals open while they went for the fibers. Young Wookiees sometimes lost arms in this ritual anyway, but most were able to complete the challenge and thus be recognized as full adults in Wookiee society. After becoming young adults, Wookiee males often embarked on what the Wookiees called the Rising Path, a stretch of time when they would leave their homes to explore and have adventures either elsewhere on Kashyyyk or in the greater galaxy. This tradition served the vital purpose of letting headstrong, hormonal young Wookiees go work their aggression out somewhere else rather than being cooped up in small homes with their families. Most Wookiees eventually returned to Kashyyyk, settled down and started families, though some Wookiees stayed on the Rising Path for their entire lives, only returning to Kashyyyk on occasion to visit family. The Wookiee honor codes also dictated Wookiees' behavior in combat and other disputes. This ensured that the Wookiees were not a particularly warlike people, and though they had a bit of a reputation for ripping people's arms out of their sockets when enraged, they didn't encourage fighting and excessive violent action. When Wookiees argued amongst themselves in public, they usually just postured unless gathering crowds goaded them into getting physical. However, Wookiees were no strangers to violence. They were hunters after all, and they held their warriors in places of honor as well. History had taught the Wookiees to be ready for war, and even if they never sought it out, few could match the Wookiees in battle. In unarmed combat, Wookiees were terrifying foes due to their great natural strength. They had a few unarmed martial arts, such as Rushi, but most Wookiees preferred the tactic of just charging in and hitting things, which typically worked about just as well. The Wookiees also had a great many kinds of weapons, which we've made a full video on if you're interested. Many of these weapons were based on designs that the Wookiees had used since their earliest days, and virtually all of them incorporated Rothrrrawr wood, Kashyyyk vines, or other organic materials from Kashyyyk. The most common and most culturally significant Wookiee weapons were Rick blades, a kind of short sword that resembled an elegant, ornately decorated machete. Wookiees also made use of other varieties of swords and spears, as well as ranged weapons. These most famously included the iconic Wookiee bowcaster. These crossbow-looking weapons were each unique, and many were handcrafted by their owners. They fired explosive quarrels encased in sheaths of green plasma, which were slung forward by Kashyyyk vine bowstrings and accelerated by magnetic fields generated by a pair of polarizing orbs set on either side of the weapon's bow. These weapons required tremendous strength to cock, but they were incredibly powerful, one of the most devastating handheld ranged weapons in the galaxy. Bowcasters weren't the Wookiees' only ranged weapons though. The Wookiees also made many kinds of blasters, slug throwers, and long guns, often large and made with bronzium and Rothrrrawr wood. But there was one weapon that Wookiees were forbidden from using under any circumstances: their claws. As we discussed earlier, Wookiees had retractable sets of sharp claws in their fingertips, which had evolved to help them climb the Rothrrrawrs. These could be powerful weapons, but the Wookiees refused to use them as such. They saw their claws as tools, to be used for climbing trees, cleaning their teeth, carving things, and other peaceful, productive activities. Only animals used their claws as weapons, Wookiees believed, and Wookiees who violated this taboo and used their claws in combat were seen as having become animals, feral and dangerous. Such Wookiees were branded with the name Madclaw and exiled from their home villages. If they ever returned, Madclaws would be treated as scum. They had no rights in Wookiee society, and their very existence was seen as a grave dishonor. Madclaws were the most well-known expression of the darker aspect of Wookiee psychology, a primal, feral subconscious that delighted in slaughter. The Wookiees called this part of themselves the Czerka, and they identified it with the Shadowlands, the dark place that their ancestors had climbed above. Through the Czerka, the Shadowlands still lived within them, and like their ancestors, the Wookiees always strived to rise above that part of themselves. But there were some who failed in this task, who felt the call of the Shadowlands in their heart, and it was these Wookiees that were the most dangerous of all. In general, the Shadowlands were an important part of Wookiee mythology. The Wookiees understood that they were not just literally dark. They felt the pall of the dark side that lay over them, the pall created by the Builder Forge. As a result, they identified the dark side and all other forms of spiritual darkness with the Shadowlands, which they understood not just as a place, but as a state of being, one dominated by the merciless dichotomy of predator and prey. To quote the mad Wookiee Hanha, who knew the Shadowlands all too well, the Shadowlands is a place where we now walk. It cannot be touched, only felt and heard around you. It is the black that surrounds us, that encircles all planets and reaches into their heart. It was not until the tribe of Czerka took me from my homeworld that I realized the Shadowlands extend forever. Every one of my people see it when they open their eyes for the first time and stare at the depths of my planet where the roots of the great trees grow. And though they did not always know it, they saw it whenever they stared into the darkness in the sky. Wookiee warriors who descended into the Shadowlands did so not just to prove their worth by hunting beasts, but to face the darkness and overcome it. But this was dangerous, because the darkness of the Shadowlands, the call of the Czerka, was corrupting. Wookiees who spent too much time in the Shadowlands, who enjoyed hunting and killing a bit too much, were believed by their kin to have been taken and consumed by the Shadowlands. These Wookiees weren't necessarily Madclaws, but they were nonetheless banished to the Shadowlands forever, forbidden from returning to their villages lest they bring the Shadowlands back with them. The battle with the Shrikir was one most Wookiees could handle, and as such, the vast majority of them were honorable, loyal, and generally peaceful. But there were always those few who had the darkness of Kashyyyk's depths in their hearts, who would embrace the call of the Shadowlands and be damned to them forever. Well, that was our look at the Wookiees of Kashyyyk. But what do you think? Would you like to see more Wookiee content in the future? Or perhaps a video about all the monsters of Kashyyyk? Let us know your thoughts in the comment section below. And as always guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.